there are some themes that are going to come out. I'm going to talk about environmental sustainability, a concept inspired by the Māori concept of taiao. So healthy land, healthy water, healthy people. And I want to talk about the importance of that from an environmental sustainability perspective, but also from a license to operate perspective. I want to talk about high value, and I'm going to talk about some of the things we need to be the best in the world at. Why have a vision at all? First of all, just let me acknowledge that it's a really challenging construct. On the one hand, there's a question about, can you draw a circle around the food and fibre sector and have a vision for the food and fibre sector? Or does it actually need to be something more encompassing that for that? Does it need to be something that all New Zealanders can buy into? On the other hand, forestry is a little bit different than fishing, is a little bit different from dairy. And so the problem is the moment you start dealing at a pan-sector level, you lose relevance at sub-sector level. So there are inherent tensions in this idea of having a vision both ways. Nevertheless, one of the things that is absolutely apparent is we have a significant transition to get through over the next 20 to 30 years. We're not going to get through that transition, or we will lose enormous value unless government and the food and fibre sector are pulling in the same direction, and unless we have really, really high quality strategy and policy, not just at sub-sector level, but across the sectors, because there are trade-offs that need to be made, unavoidable trade-offs, and I'll touch on some of those a little bit later. And so a core idea in some of our thinking is actually, while we might be feeling, some of us, a little bit ratty with the quality of policy coming out of the government at the moment, one of the questions that I would ask you as leaders is, are we really providing the quality of pan-sector policy advice to the government that underpins a partnership? And my answer to that would be absolutely not. So let's look first to ourselves and organise ourselves to be delivering really strong pan-sector policy. By the way, we're not. So where do you start this vision? Where do you start developing a vision across the food and fibre sector? Really challenging. What we did is we looked at a sample of organisations across the industry, and what we were doing is we were looking for convergence. Are there things that organisations across the sector are focusing on? What do we think in our silos is important? Where is there convergence? Happily for us, there is quite a lot of convergence. When we do that analysis, what we see is that there are strong themes that emerge. I'm not going to focus too much on this page because I've got a more summarised version of it in the next slide. Almost all sectors and organisations that we look at as we go across the country are focused on trying to add value, on long-term prosperity, on trying to move up the value curve. A really common theme. Similarly, organisations, industries are they're asking the question, what can we be best at? Where are we best to compete? How do we differentiate? What makes us better than the competition? So this idea of where do we have advantage, or where can we develop advantage? And it's different across different sectors. Finally, the focus on environmental sustainability is really strong across the sector, which is, in the context of the national dialogue, where it's fair to say, fingers are being pointed at the sector and people are asking the question, how good a job is the sector doing environmentally? It is fair to say that the sector is focusing strongly on environmental sustainability, has been focusing strongly on it for some time, and is making significant investments in that issue. And so the idea that we're not focused on environmental sustainability is not borne out by what we actually see on the ground. Now, I just want to just focus on some of these other themes because they're important. There is an emerging focus on health and nutrition. That is not a New Zealand thing. That is a global thing. So there's this focus on health and nutrition and the interaction between how we feed the planet and environmental sustainability. It's a major focus. It's a major focus globally. The other things on this list, community trust and quality, I mean, they're almost hygiene factors. We need those things. They're important, but they're not necessarily the basis of competitive advantage. Now, It's lovely to have some convergence, very, very handy when you're trying to develop a vision for the primary sector. But a different question is, well, are those the right things to focus on? Drawing from the situational analysis that I mentioned earlier, a few key ideas. The first thing is that the food and fibre sector in New Zealand is not a sunset industry. It is in fact 14 million hectares. It's 1 in 10 jobs, it's 20% of GDP. And it makes up 75% of our merchandise exports. So it remains incredibly important to the economy. Nor is its importance likely to recede. That's because the New Zealand economy is forecast to grow at 2% annually out to 2060, Treasury forecasts. When we look for replacements to the place of the sector in the economy, I'm talking about industries like tourism or health exports or education or high tech, all of those industries need to continue to grow as well. But the thought that they're going to grow fast enough to replace the role of the food and fibre sector is not borne out in any of the data. And so a prosperous New Zealand is one where the sector continues to grow at 2% a year. Now, a really good question is, can we grow at 2% a year? Well, on the one hand, we've been growing at about 4%, if you look right across the sector, at about 4% a year for the last 10 years. On the other hand, an enormous amount of that growth has been about expansion and intensification of dairy and a change of land use in that regard. Growing within an environmental envelope, growing sustainably, particularly if some of our large sectors are potentially constrained, is a different thing from just growing when you can expand and intensify as fast as you want to. So actually the 2% a year is going to require real focus, and it does imply optimisation of land use. So a really important idea is some of our sectors make a lot more money than other sectors on a per labour use or per labour unit or per hectare basis. So optimisation of land use, sustainable growth are really important implications that come out of this. Headline though is simply this: it's not a sunset sector. The rest of this conversation happens in the context of growth. That's really important, not just for farmers, but for all New Zealanders. Now, I want to talk about environmental sustainability, and this gets, this is fraught. So I just want to acknowledge this is a visceral conversation, and it's visceral on two sides. The first thing is that this planet is warming. We have Paris Accord targets. It's most unlikely that we're going to hit the Paris Accord targets. And the reason for that is that countries all over the world are not meeting the milestones. That we produced more carbon this last year than we've ever produced before. That there is tremendous inertia in the system. Think about the transport fleet. Think about coal burning for electricity and heat. There is enormous inertia in the system. The population continues to grow. And the global economy, and particularly those middle classes, continue to grow, which means consumption continues to grow. We're not, in all likelihood, going to meet the Paris Accord targets. That means the planet will continue to warm, and the impacts of climate change will become increasingly profound. I'm talking about droughts, I'm talking about floods, I'm talking about groundwater running out in important food bowls around the world, depleting in important food bowls around the world. I'm talking about wildfires. I'm talking about the global food production system coming under enormous pressure, and that has economic implications, and I'll touch on it if I get to it. And so we have a climate crisis. That climate crisis is emerging rapidly into the mind space of the public. As that happens, there is the emergence of fear. And as you're all aware, what that means is that this is not a rational conversation. This is a conversation which is a passionate conversation, and it's a conversation where people are looking to blame people. And so there is enormous fear associated with this conversation in the minds of the public, and in all likelihood that fear gets worse. It's as good as it gets today, and that's because we're not going to hit the Paris Accord targets. The effects of climate change are going to get worse. And so this environment of fear and a lack of lack of space for rational dialogue, it gets worse, it doesn't get better. On the other hand, I have had the privilege of talking to farmers, many farmers across this country, around the country over the last 6 months. And they make a couple of little points to me. They say, hang on a minute, New Zealand as a whole is responsible for 0.03 of carbon emissions. So the idea that we're contributing materially to climate change just isn't borne out by the facts. You say that we're responsible for 50% of emissions in New Zealand, but that's because of the structure of our economy, where we've got a high percentage of renewables and a really big food and fibre sector. And by the way, we play a big part in this economy, and we export a lot of our food. And by the way, we produce for this food with a lower carbon footprint than others. I have been farming my land for generations, and I take care of it. And I, by the way, have spent a fortune on farming as sustainably as I can. I've done my fencing, and my riparian strips are in, and my effluent system is in. And I am absolutely passionate about the biodiversity and the water quality on my land. And now you're talking about imposing taxes on me and forcing me to de-intensify in a way that's not economic. And by the way, the global population is growing, and how are we going to cope if we can't produce food? And I don't see people taking less flights. And where are we up to with the electrification of the system, of transport? And what about the investment in renewables, which is also what the Productivity Commission had to say about a low emissions New Zealand? And by the way, it's nice to talk about changes in farming systems, but it takes time to change farming systems. I can't change farming systems overnight, and if you want to have a conversation with me about methane, you better be prepared to have a conversation with me about the technology and the investment to get through the R&D curve associated with methane. Do I sound like I understand? Yeah. Anger, concern about the future. Many of us, the farming sector, many of us in our 50s and 60s, genuine concern about the sort of feeling is, okay, we'll do our bit, but we're only part of the problem. And what we need is really high quality policy and leadership and a viable pathway forward, because if we can't make it work economically, we can't make it work. And so a plea for time. The climate change agenda is enormously urgent. So there's real pressure on this conversation about time. And we've just had a conversation in this country. Just this week, methane's topical, and we've got our 10% target over the next 10 years. And then we've got 23 to 48% target out beyond that, and we don't have the science to go with the second target. But actually, we think we can probably deliver the first one. We think we can probably deliver the first one, and what we've got is time and a really strong economic imperative now to get on and do the R&D, and we need to partner with government to do that R&D so we can deliver the second tranche of methane targets out to 2050. But boy, she's a fraught conversation, this one. Now, a really important idea is that we've never been positioned more weakly as a sector in the PR thing, PR positioning in New Zealand. We've never been positioned more weakly. And yet, when you take into account the journey we all need to go on, it's hugely important that we position ourselves in a leadership space. It's hugely important that farmers speak with authority, and that the quality of our own policy work is outstanding, because we can't win this PR battle by what we do behind the farm gate. We can only win it if New Zealanders are comfortable with the country's environmental positioning, and with the food and fibre sector's environmental positioning as part of that. And so this is about The opportunity is to acknowledge the global context. The opportunity is to share with New Zealand, to have shared targets in the environmental space with the rest of New Zealand. And the opportunity is for us to work on a pan-sector basis to develop first-class policy in order that we can make the transition ahead of us. We have a challenge in terms of the architecture of our system at the moment. And the specific challenge is that if we talk about carbon, we haven't done the policy work so that the sector can step forward and say, here's our view of an optimal carbon price to enable viable farming, but to support optimal land use. And by the way, this perspective is reconciled between dairy farmers and sheep and beef farmers. Here's our view of an optimal policy for genetic engineering. Here's our view of an optimal policy for water storage on a pan-sector basis. Here's our view of the top 10 science priorities, applied science priorities, the size of the prize, the probability of success, the investment required, the amount of time it's going to take. Here's our view of those applied science priorities. And here's our view of whether the science sector is appropriately configured and the funding model is appropriately configured to deliver on those top 10 science challenges, to enable not only us to farm in an environmentally sustainable way, but for us to continue to grow. So we ourselves have a leadership challenge. We have an ecosystem challenge. And it's hugely important that we step forward, we get our heads around that, and we take a leadership position as we seek to move forward into the future. Now, I'm out of time. I just want to show you the draft words in our vision. And I want to point something out to you. Our vision is to produce the world's most distinctive, trusted, sought-after food and fibres. Partnered with nature, they speak of our land, water and people. Taiao drives our prosperity, our innovation and leadership. We aspire to be good ancestors. As Kaitiaki, we're proud to honour the place we call home. Now, this is not a final version of the vision. It's a long-form vision. I'm fully aware that it needs to be shorter. And we have used some Māori concepts in here, and we need to be careful about that because it's not necessarily appropriate that we do so. And so this will evolve over time. But what I wanted to point out to you is taiao, this idea of healthy land, healthy water, healthy rivers, healthy communities, sits right at the heart of the vision. Because for all of us, environmental sustainability represents just a critical part of what's going to underpin our way, not only to farm successfully into the future, but to have a New Zealand that is a safe and prosperous place for our children. So I'm going to finish talking and really keen to have any discussion with you in the next 15 minutes. Sure.
I'll just get some.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Lain. A great deal has been made out of methane, farm methane emissions over the last couple of years.
Yes.
And I'd like to point out to you and all the people here present that over the last 150 years or so, farming has gradually replaced native forest and wetlands here in New Zealand. And of course, farming, especially livestock farming, produces methane. The original cover, native forest and wetlands in particular, produced a lot of methanes as well.
Sure.
So if all the farmland were to go back to wetlands and native forest, chances are New Zealand would be producing about as much methane as what we do now.
Yeah.
So methane is actually, it's a function of life, really. And why, what logic is there in actually taxing the methane? because it's not going to achieve anything. We're not going to lower methane emission much. It's going to actually ruin our farming. It's going to be very damaging for our farming system
Yes.
and New Zealand economy, as you pointed out.
Sure.
So have we got the wrong vision of this methane issue?
Okay, so I get it. So I'm going to give you you've asked a sophisticated question. I'm going to give you a sophisticated answer. This is not a New Zealand issue. We have a global population growing from 7 billion people through to 9.5 billion people by about 2050. So a rapidly growing global population. Our global food production system, on the one hand, we need to increase the amount of food that we produce globally. On the other hand, we need to reduce the environmental footprint with which we produce that food. So to give you a sense of that, some people say we'll need to double the amount of food that we produce. Other people use a figure of between 25 and 70%. So it does depend on which numbers you look. This conversation, so there is a global imperative to do two things. To increase the amount of food that we produce. And that's good from a demand side perspective for us as farmers. There is also a global imperative to produce that food with an environmentally smaller footprint. And I'm not just talking about emissions, I'm also importantly talking about water, and I'm talking about impacts on soil. Now there's a dialogue out there which I'm sure you've all heard, and that dialogue goes that the way that we farm today is going to change very radically. We're going to produce a lot more food synthetically. We're going to see consumers swap across and eat a lot more plant-based nutrition. We're going to see the proportion of animal nutrition in diets reduce over time. And that those changes need to happen in order for us to have an environmentally sustainable future. And the commercial drivers, that this issue of carbon emissions and methane pricing and the focus on nitrous oxide is part of that dialogue, because what people will say is economically, if we can put the commercial drivers in place, then we will, and we accurately price what we currently call externalities, in other words, emissions, that what that'll do is it'll drive the portfolio change. And that dialogue isn't wrong. That dialogue is a legitimate dialogue. And by the way, because of the increasing pressure in this whole environmental sustainability space, no matter what we think of it, we don't escape the dialogue. Does that make sense? So we're caught in this, whether we like it or not. We're part of this dialogue. We can't escape contending with climate change, and we can't escape doing our part and responding to mitigating the impacts on climate change. Now, I just want to say, I'm going to go on a quick tangent. It's not just mitigating the impact of climate change, it's also climate change adaptability. New Zealand is a really, really wealthy country. We've got good land, we've got good water, but boy, we need to get our act sorted out with things like water storage in this country because of the impact on climate change, on volatility. And so climate change adaptability and our focus on that from a policy perspective is of overriding importance. Back to your main point. Two things are true. We absolutely need to see a rapid evolution of the way that food is produced globally. And that is important for all of us as global systems. On the other hand, the dialogue that meat is over, and it's all going to be plant-based and synthetic-based, is rubbish. There will be very strong demand for animal proteins going into the future. What is imperative is that we produce those animal proteins as environmentally sustainably as what we can, and that we put the science in place and the farming systems in place to deliver it. And so I understand, and I'm going to get right to the point now, I understand that we can all find things about the science and the dialogue that we don't like. But actually the positioning that I propose we take is to acknowledge where it is we need to get to globally, to ensure that our own policy work is first class, to put our shoulders to the wheel and to do our bit, because we will never win the PR battle by pushing back on the detail around the science or the burden being placed on us. It's about sharing a goal, getting the science right, getting the farming systems right, and driving into a future that is sustainable for all of us.
Don't we have to actually get out in this community and say, well, look, farming, actually we're carbon neutral.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more.
And we are methane neutral.
Uh-huh. So I understand, but you don't get to have that conversation today because no one will listen to you. I promise you. And the reason that no one will listen to you is because we haven't created the space to have the conversation. And it's not until we have the shared goals that we get to have a voice. And so what I'm saying to you is before we get to, and I understand you're saying let's have a data rational conversation. Please understand that I understand. I understand that, and you're not wrong about that. But what I'm saying is first we have to have a conversation about shared goals. First we need to win hearts and minds. First we need to win hearts, and then we can win minds. At the moment we're just seen as defensive and angry. And it's not our fault. I suspect that you and I could spend an hour on this.
We might have